Have you ever watched a Matt Dillahunty debate and thought, God, there's something wrong with what he's saying, but I just can't pinpoint, I can't figure out what it is. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. If you like apologetics, you want to learn more about apologetics, subscribe to my channel, turn on the little bell so you can get notifications for new videos that I post. So about a year ago, I hosted a debate between Matt Dillahunty and Mike Winger on my channel on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. During Matt's opening speech, he said that claims are not evidence. And when Matt initially said this, I immediately thought there's something wrong with this, but I couldn't exactly put my finger on it. Now, as we'll see throughout this video, it's actually pretty easy to see what's wrong with this idea. So just stick around. You're going to enjoy this. So let's watch a few clips from Matt to get the context.
When you say Jesus appeared to the 500, that's just a claim. We've spoken to no one from the 500, no one who was there to even speak to the 500 or anything else. When you present these things as evidence, they are in fact just more and more claims from essentially the same sources, from anonymous authors. And what Mike has kind of done at the start of this is to say, well, really, here's all this evidence, and it's the evidence for the supernatural, and you don't just get to throw all of it out. But it's not the evidence. It is the claim. It is a bunch of claims, and it is claims upon claims as well. What we have here is this list of claims coming from a source. The Bible's the source, not the evidence. It's the source of the claims, not the evidence.
So now, if this distinction is a little strange to you, you're not alone. When I first heard this, I was thinking there's something wrong with this, but I can't put my finger on it. It's really unclear how this distinction is supposed to actually work. So a little later on in the discussion, I asked him to clarify what he meant by this distinction. I'll play the clip for you guys, we'll listen to his response, and then I'll offer a breakdown, a Bertuzzian breakdown of what I think is going on here. So claims versus evidence. Would you mind defining those two? What's that distinction?
Well, so a claim is an assertion that something is such and so, and evidence is actually evidence that supports the fact that it's thus and so.
So Matt says that a claim is an assertion and evidence is evidence. Now, this is not meant to bash Matt, but I think it's important to note how unhelpful this distinction, this explanation that he gave actually is. Imagine if Matt had asked me to make a distinction between angels and God, and I said, oh, well, angels are angelic beings and God is God. I think Matt or anyone else watching would pounce all over that. They'd think that that's a terrible explanation of the distinction there. Now, points like this are actually going to be important later on, so just keep it in mind as we move forward. When you initially heard Matt say claims are not evidence, you might have been thinking, God, yeah, that's a really good point. We want evidence, we don't want claims. But let's slow down and let's really think clearly about this. A philosopher once told me that philosophy is best done slowly, and I completely agree with that. So when I asked for clarification, Matt said that a claim is an assertion. And what is an assertion? An assertion is basically just a statement that someone makes. And actually, if you think about it, there are different kinds of assertions. Sometimes people make assertions or statements for no deeper reason. Let's call this an unreasonable assertion. But other times, people make assertions because they have some deeper reason for thinking that that assertion is true. I call this a reasonable assertion. The distinction that I'm making between an unreasonable assertion and a reasonable assertion is going to be key for understanding why Matt's claim here is not entirely accurate. So let's look at a couple examples to help understand the distinction that I'm trying to draw here. An unreasonable assertion would be if my daughter, my 4-year-old daughter, told me that there are aliens on Mars eating buckets of ice cream every day. If I were to ask her where she got that from, she'd probably just say, well, I don't know, I made it up, I'm pretending. That's what she would say. So let's contrast that with a reasonable assertion. A reasonable assertion would be if she told me that while she was at school, one of the boys in her class fell down and busted his lip. If I asked her where she got that from, she would quickly tell me, oh, well, I saw it happen. So a reasonable assertion is based on something deeper, like an experience. So in my view, an unreasonable assertion does not provide a whole lot of evidence that an assertion is true. My daughter's assertion that there's aliens on Mars eating buckets of ice cream every day doesn't provide a whole lot of evidence that there's aliens on Mars. But on the flip side, notice this, a reasonable assertion can provide good evidence that the assertion is true. My daughter's assertion that she saw a boy fall down and bust his lip open is actually pretty good evidence that that happened. But now let's complicate things a little bit. Suppose that instead of telling me directly. She told her teacher, who then told my wife, who then told me. I'd still be in possession of pretty good evidence that a boy in her class fell down and busted his lip. This is not like irrefutable proof that her claim or assertion is true, but nevertheless, it's pretty good evidence. And what this implies is that some claims can provide good evidence. In particular, what I've argued is that reasonable assertions can provide or can constitute good evidence. So a potential reason why you are skeptical of Matt's initial claim is because you implicitly recognized what I've just explicitly recognized. Some claims don't provide a whole lot of evidence, but other claims do. It really just depends on the source of the claim and then on the claim itself. And before you watch any further, I think I know what you're thinking, that I'm ignoring Matt's context here. I'm ignoring the context of where this claim came from. When Matt says that claims are not evidence, he's not talking about every claim. He's talking about specific claims. Namely, claims about the miraculous. Claims about like what happened to a boy falling down at school. That is not anything that's ordinary. But a claim about a miraculous event, that is extraordinary. Now, before we look at this, and this is really important here, because there's a difference between this new claim and what Matt originally said. Matt did not define a claim as a claim about something miraculous. Rather, listen again to what he said.
So a claim is an assertion that something is such and so.
This is why it can be so difficult sometimes to follow like what Matt is trying to say in his debates. Sometimes when Matt is asked to clarify his position so that they can be analyzed at a deeper level, the explanation that Matt is going to give is not going to be entirely accurate unless you already sort of follow his work and understand what he's trying to get at. All right, so now let's jump back into analysis mode and see exactly what's going on here. For clarity, I'm just going to throw this little claim on the screen so you guys can look at it in a sentence form. A claim about some miraculous event cannot constitute evidence that the event happened. One more time. A claim about some miraculous event cannot constitute evidence that the event happened. Now keep in mind, I've already argued that some claims can provide some evidence. But that really ought to get us thinking. If some claims can constitute evidence, why can't claims about the miraculous constitute evidence of the miraculous? Like, what is the difference here? And this is how we do philosophy. What is it about miraculous claims that disqualify them from having evidence? What is it? Think about that. Before I answer this question, I actually have a quick announcement. We are officially announcing a Spanish version of Capturing Christianity. The Spanish-speaking community is so underserved when it comes to apologetics, and I aim to fix that, at least with respect to my ministry. My plan is to hire someone full-time to basically transcribe, do voiceovers, and edit my videos to post them in Spanish on a new YouTube channel. I've narrowed down my selection between a few different candidates, and so once I raise enough funds, I'm going to hire this person full-time, and we're going to launch our channel. If you'd like to help support this project, head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity and pledge your support there. You can actually find more information about this project in the description of the video. Okay, so let me give another example that I hear sometimes from skeptics that will help illustrate where Matt is coming from. Some skeptics will parody resurrection arguments by saying, well, look, we have all of these claims of alien abductions, but that doesn't mean that aliens exist. These people seem to really think that they experienced an alien abduction, but that does not provide good evidence for aliens. Now, before I started working on the next part of this video, I actually went and looked at some of the more popular alien abduction stories. The first one that I came across was posted back in August of 2019. However, it's a short clip of an interview that happened on the Oprah Winfrey Show back in 1994. Now, you might be thinking that I'm going to show you a clip of the guy who says that he was abducted, but I'm actually going to show you a clip of a Harvard psychiatrist who's investigated this and came to a really interesting conclusion after looking at all of these.
Dr. Mack, what does this all mean? What is all of this, you know, the book where you talk to hundreds of patients and describe in detail what they say they have experienced, you with your credentials coming from Harvard, what do you think this all means?
Well, let me explain first why I concluded this is not psychiatric, why these people are not psychiatrically disturbed. Because I was concerned, when I first heard about this, I thought this must be madness. But when I heard that hundreds of thousands of people all over the country...
Stunt? Why not just
because these people, like Peter, I can't tell you how difficult it is to get people to go on television to talk about this. People are not interested in being before the public. They're very ashamed because they get ridiculed, humiliated about it. This is not something anybody does this is not a club anybody wants to belong to. This is not something people do because they want to be filmed or get on publicity. It's very difficult to get people to come forth and acknowledge they've had these experiences.
Yes, and I've read interviews with people who have come forward years ago who wish that they hadn't at this point. Go ahead.
So when I heard of it, hundreds of thousands of people all over the country, from various polls, we know maybe even millions of people have had very similar experiences. They don't know each other. The details that they're describing were not in the media. They have nothing to gain by it. They feel ashamed about it. That's number one. When I also heard that this was occurring in children as young as 2 or 3 years old, that ruled out personality explanations. It's associated with UFOs independently observed by witnesses, by media, by neighbors. It's also associated with physical findings and, as said before, the people, when examined, are not psychiatrically disturbed. So the only thing that behaves like that is real experience.
Yeah, you say that it's trauma, that it's trauma.
It's traumatic. Not, yeah. Real experiences are the only thing that occurs like that. Psychosis isn't like that. Madness is not like that. Dreams are not like that. Fantasy is not like that. Now, if these are real experiences, what is going on? What's the source of these experiences? That's an interesting
that's the question. What's going on?
Now, as I investigated Dr. Mack a little bit further, he did not immediately just accept that these alien abduction stories proved aliens or anything like that at all. He was actually really skeptical. He even says that like the alien abductees were skeptical themselves because they knew how silly it was. So as Dr. Mack started to investigate this a little bit further and interview more people, in other words, as the claims started to pile up, he started to have a little bit more difficult time explaining away their experiences. In another interview he did, he said this: "We have two choices at this point. Faced with something which doesn't fit our worldview, we have a choice. We can try to jam it into conventional explanations, or we can say, well, maybe we don't know everything. Maybe we need to expand our notions of reality to say, I don't know. There's a mystery here." Now, this to me, it doesn't sound like he's admitting that aliens exist or anything like that. Rather, what he's doing is he's acknowledging that our conventional explanations don't work, and so we basically have to widen our pool of possibilities, possible explanations, to see which one works best. Now, if you think about like how explanations work and probability and inductive inferences, if you think about how all of that works, there's nothing wrong with this. If your explanations don't account for the data, you've got to look at other explanations. Here's my point with all of this, and I'm going to be very blunt. It's intellectually dishonest to just ignore evidence that goes against what you already believe. Now, if you want to tell me, oh, look, Cameron, it's just about the evidence. Like, all I care about is the evidence. I just want to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If that's the case for you, you want to say that, then you can't arbitrarily pick and choose what explanations you're going to consider and which ones you're not. That's literally the definition of confirmation bias. Now, for the record, and I'm going to be very clear about this, I do not think that claims of alien abductions prove that aliens exist. Nor am I saying that evidence for the resurrection and evidence for alien abductions are on par with each other. That's not what I'm saying at all. The following distinction I'm going to make might help clear up some of the confusion. In the beginning of the video, I argued that some claims can constitute some evidence. But in my view, that you have some evidence that X happened does not necessarily mean that you have sufficient evidence that X happened. I can have some evidence that Frank is the murderer without having sufficient evidence that Frank is the murderer. For example, suppose that Frank was like identified by a witness out of a lineup. That's some evidence that he was the murderer, but it might not be sufficient evidence to convict him. Also note here that the evidence that we have in this case is a claim from a witness. I think that the only intellectually responsible thing that we can say about the resurrection is that based on the claims of the New Testament authors, we have some evidence that the event happened. No one can rationally disagree with that. In other words, the question is not about whether we have any evidence for the resurrection. The question is, how good is the evidence? How strong is the evidence for the resurrection? Now, whether or not Matt would agree with this, I think he should agree with this. And even if he did agree with this, Matt is not completely out of options. Well, not yet. So here's what he could say. He could say, I can admit that claims about the miraculous can provide some evidence for miracles, but they can't provide sufficient evidence for miracles. Now, before we take a closer look at this newest claim, notice how far we've come from the original claim. At first, the claim was simply, claims are not evidence. Then the claim became, claims about the miraculous are not evidence. And now the new claim is, claims about the miraculous are not sufficient evidence. I just want to point out that this is progress. Philosophy can lead to progress. And also, this is just like a quick side note. Did you notice that all of these are claims? If claims are not evidence, we have no evidence that anything that Matt said, any of these principles, these philosophical principles, are true. And maybe you think that Matt does have evidence for these principles, but he didn't give any in the debate. He doesn't really ever do that. Something to think about. Marinate on that for a little bit. All right, so continuing my Bertuzzian breakdown, I'm going to give 2 reasons to think that this newest claim that claims about the miraculous can't provide sufficient evidence for the miraculous. I'm going to provide 2 reasons to think that that newest claim is false. First, I'm going to argue that modern attempts at defending this claim are all question-begging. And then second, I'm going to argue that probability theory has shown that this claim is false. Now, if that second reason sounds a little too technical for you, don't worry. I'm not going to be showing a whole bunch of equations on the screen. So on to my first argument. This claim is question-begging. The most noteworthy attempt at defending this claim came from David Hume in his treatise On Miracles. In his book, Hume, Holism, and Miracles, Christian philosopher David Johnson has shown that Hume's argument, and every contemporary version of it, ultimately begs the question. Here's a quote from the first chapter of Dr. Johnson's book. Hume's argument against miracles either obviously begs the question or becomes obscure, and so we must turn to the reconstructions of Hume's argument. If anyone claims that one of these reconstructed arguments is what Hume really meant, or what Hume was up to in the argument about miracles, I am perfectly happy to agree, for these other arguments most certainly beg the question in their own and deeper way. So here's how C.S. Lewis summarized the basic problem with Hume's argument. Now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if, in other words, they have never happened, why then they never have. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all of the reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. The question, do miracles occur, and the question, is the course of nature absolutely uniform, are the same question asked in 2 different ways. Hume, by sleight of hand, treats them as 2 different questions. He first answers yes to the question whether nature is absolutely uniform, and then uses this yes as a ground for answering no to the question, do miracles occur? The single real question which he set out to answer is never discussed at all. He gets the answer to one form of the question by assuming the answer to another form of the same question. Here's another way of seeing that the reasoning behind Hume's argument is circular. Some skeptics will say that a miracle is just the least likely thing to occur ever. But how do we know that? How do we know that a miracle is just the least likely thing to ever occur? Skeptics will usually appeal at this point to our inductive experience of the world. Look, nobody experiences miracles. I haven't experienced a miracle, therefore they're the least likely thing to occur. But listen to that again. Nobody experiences miracles. That's the part that is question-begging. We can only know that nobody experiences miracles if we already know that miracles never happen and therefore nobody experiences them. The whole thing just reeks of confirmation bias. Listen, this is not rocket science. Of course we're going to arrive at the conclusion that miracles never happen if we ignore all the evidence that points in the opposite direction. That's what Dr. Johnson points out in his excellent book. It's actually really good. I highly recommend reading this. Now, second, apart from being guilty of confirmation bias and obviously begging the question against miracles, this claim is just completely false. Recall the distinction I made earlier between having some evidence and having sufficient evidence. I gave the example of a man being identified by a witness. That's some evidence that this guy is the murderer, but it's not necessarily sufficient evidence that he's the murderer. But imagine that instead of having one person ID the suspect, we now had 10 independent witnesses that all ID'd the same suspect. Now we have a lot more evidence. What's the probability that 10 independent eyewitnesses would all ID the same person? And remember, the only evidence that we're even considering in this case are claims from witnesses. Enough claims can provide sufficient evidence. Now, unfortunately, murders do happen, but they're very rare. It's very unlikely that any particular individual is going to be a murderer. And so before we look at any evidence, it's already inherently unlikely that Frank in particular is the murderer. And here's the crucial part about this. This is important. Enough evidence can outweigh that initial improbability. Enough people claiming that they saw Frank murder somebody is going to be sufficient evidence to convict him. This same probabilistic structure is true for miracles as well. Even if we grant that before we look at any evidence, every miracle event is just inherently unlikely, we can still reasonably conclude that a miracle happened given enough testimonial evidence. And there's absolutely no way around this, well, unless you want to deny probability theory. Probability theorists have shown that enough evidence can overcome any non-zero prior probability. For a lengthier discussion on this, check out my interview with Dr. Timothy McGrew on probability and miracles. The point is that Hume's argument against miracles is an abject failure. That's actually the title of another book arguing against Hume from an agnostic philosopher named John Earman. Hume's Abject Failure. Here's a quote from the concluding chapter. In Of Miracles, Hume pretends to stand on philosophical high ground, hurling down thunderbolts against miracle stories. The thunderbolts are supposed to issue from general principles about inductive inference and the credibility of eyewitness testimony, but when these principles are made explicit and examined under the lens of Bayesianism, they are found to be either vapid, specious, or at variance with actual scientific practice. I want you to really pay attention to this next part. He was able to create the illusion of a powerful argument by maintaining ambiguities in his claims against miracles by the use of forceful prose and confident pronouncements. Sound like anybody you know? I'll leave you with another quote from Earman. I find it ironic that so many readers of Hume's essay have been subdued by its eloquence, and I find it astonishing how well posterity has treated Of Miracles, given how completely the confection collapses under a little probing. No doubt, this generous treatment stems in part from the natural assumption that someone of Hume's genius must have produced a powerful set of considerations. Isn't that kind of what skeptics think about Matt? But I suspect that in more than a few cases, it also involves the all too familiar phenomenon of endorsing an argument because the conclusion is liked. Who likes that conclusion? There is also the understandable, if deplorable, desire to sneer at the foibles of the less enlightened. That kind of actually reminds me of Richard Dawkins. By the way, comparing Matt Dillahunty to David Hume is not actually an insult. David Hume was a genius. He was a really, really smart guy. He was wrong about a lot of things, but he was nevertheless really smart. All right, we've gone through a lot of things in this video, so let me just sort of summarize the main points. The point of this video was to look at one of the reasons why Matt can catch people off guard in his debates. The example we looked at was his claim that claims are not evidence. I argued that claims in the form of reasonable assertions can constitute evidence. We then looked at two additional ways the claim could be modified so as to not be obviously false. The first way was to say that claims of the miraculous are not evidence of the miraculous. And there I argued that having some evidence is not the same as having sufficient evidence. And the only intellectually responsible position to take is that claims of miracles provide some evidence of miracles. The second modification was that claims of the miraculous are not sufficient evidence of the miraculous. In response, I argued that this claim is both question-begging and false, given advancements in probability theory. So what initially appeared as like a decent distinction completely breaks down on closer inspection. So before you watch another Matt Dillahunty debate, remember that philosophy is best done slowly. Oh, and by the way, Christianity is true.